Good morning. Captain Matt Editor Retired here, doing another one of these observation post Facebook Live broadcasts. Welcome to the show, I guess you'd call it. Today I'm planning on briefly, not very much. I only heard about it recently, but I was talking to, I should have said the subject. I'm planning on doing a discussion of the internal and external audit processes. So, I was talking to the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman the other day, and the lady, I was speaking to for 2 hours and 20 minutes. Now, I've done a lot of talking to these people over the years, but I haven't seen anything substantive come out of it. And I'm not always calling about myself. I'd say 1% of the time I might have asked about something for myself. Usually I'm trying to help get systemic things fixed. So, my first thought was that, what's the use of an internal audit? Because I had been reading these things for years, like Veterans Affairs. Go to their Google Veterans Affairs Canada internal audits, and then go to their link, and you can look back at all the different audits they've done. They've done an audit in 2009 on the rehabilitation program. No, appeals. The internal review process that I call infernal review. And 2008, they did a pilot project audit on the rehabilitation program, and they've done several evaluations of the earnings loss benefit financial benefits program. 2019 they did a exam of the case management. They called it, it's not a program, you see, it's a service. But in that one I was especially incensed when I saw they said that 758 veterans died between 2018 and 14 and 18. In a 4-year period, they killed 758 veterans. I didn't think that was very nice. Funny me. Now, the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman lady told me about the fact that they had a recent audit on the 4th of August. So I didn't want to look at it because I knew if I looked at it, it would drive me up the wall. So I finally took a look at it, and I didn't go into it in detail, but I just want to talk about the difference between an external and internal audit. And I'll go over the other stuff later. But back in 2015, the spring of 2015, the Office of the Auditor General of Canada did an external audit on the Canadian Forces Ombudsman. Now, I've read that several times, so I'll speak to that one first. Now, I don't see much difference between the two ombudsmen, except for the fact that, well, why do we have two ombudsmen? I believe that the ombudsmen are totally inept, totally useless, and they were set up for that purpose. The government didn't want to, in my humble opinion, give an agency the authority to lord it over them. So they set up a toothless organization in the Canadian Forces Ombudsman first, and then later they followed the same example and they set up a toothless organization there where basically they can make recommendations, but they can't order a fix to a problem if they investigate. So I firmly believe they either need the power to order, which probably wouldn't make him an ombudsman, or maybe we need to have some kind of inspector general program where people can look in there and people will be actually afraid of the person doing the audit if they find something wrong. Maybe we need something like that. But in the 2015 spring report, the Auditor General of Canada stated that the people who were, I'm trying to train my eyes to look above my phone because I get bad eyes. I think my bifocals might need replacing. I'm getting blurry eyes when I watch this. But they said that the Canadian Forces Ombudsman did not train their people properly to investigate stuff. They said that there was internal disputes within the organization, that by the time people decided to say the hell with this and quit, then a lot of the institutional knowledge went with those people who quit. And then they had to hire people new, and then they didn't have the knowledge and experience and training that the other people had. That's a failing of their system. If they can't retain and keep people with good management policies, that's the problem. But, the biggest problem was the failure to tell people how to investigate, how to train people in how to investigate. Because if you're an investigatory body and you don't teach people, you don't train people how to investigate, how can you do your function? How can you do your duty? How can you investigate things when you don't have a clue about how to investigate? And that was an external audit. And that's one that I believe we can trust more than an internal audit. No matter how you look at, say, the Veterans Affairs Ombudsman, well, the problem is Okay, I'll give you this, and it might take a little bit of thinking. I got into a little bit of an argument with one of the ladies I speak to at the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman a while ago because I told her that they weren't independent. Now, I didn't make that comment based on just my opinion. I looked at a case in the 1980s, I think it was 1987, the Valente Supreme Court of Canada, and they were talking about the judicial independence of judges. And to have independence, they said they had to have the people that are paying them shouldn't have control over paying them. They shouldn't be getting pensions from them. So there's a lot of functions. You might say someone's independent, but are they truly independent? Now, that was my whole point about the internal review process. Are they truly independent? Now, with that in mind, think about this. The Office of Veterans Ombudsman is said to be an independent organization. If they're an independent organization, what gives Veterans Affairs Canada the right to do an internal audit on them? If they were truly independent, they wouldn't be able to have an internal audit. Fault my logic. Fault my logic. I do not believe what I said to be wrong. Okay? Now, I mentioned in the kind of a preview that I posted on my group Facebook, in Facebook observation post, I said to Pat Strogren, who was a Veterans Ombudsman in the past, I said, didn't this come up in his tenure? Because he wrote a book on it. Now, I never bought it, and I intend to buy it one of these days. I read some of it on Google Books that you can have a free preview. But the fact of the matter is, it's very unclear about who they report to. Okay? In the military, it's very simple. You have a dictatorship within a democracy, where the Chief of Defense Staff is the head honcho, and basically he dictates, and then everybody has to say how high if he says jump. But if you put the Veterans Ombudsman within the Veterans Affairs system, and then you try to tell us that it is independent, then I'm telling you, you're lying to me, buddy. If you're telling me they're independent, but they're part of the organization, well, the facts don't jive, okay? You know, you weigh one thing against the other thing, and you say something doesn't add up here. So, again, my point about all this, and I'll go back to, because of the way these, bear with me, it might make it more interesting or it might lose people, but because I have all this stuff in my head I'd like to share in case anything ever happened to me. You never know, I could die, have a stroke or something, you never know. So I want to have some kind of documentary record. And I've often thought of people saying to me, veterans have told me, what can we do to help, Matt? And I really don't know what they could do besides watching, becoming aware, and sharing the information. Now, recently I thought of doing a project like OPI, and I think that means Office of Primary Interest, OPI, or maybe it means Officer of Primary Interest. But OPI, I was thinking about doing something and seeing if I could firm some of this stuff out to people. So if they came to me and said that they could do one project, I could say, okay, well, how would you like this? And they can always come back to me for explanations and stuff. And if anybody thinks that might be a good idea, send me a message after, make a comment later, I don't care. Just, I thought of maybe that would help lessen the load on me and also try to get the stuff out to a bigger audience. At one point I thought about doing seminars, probably for the Royal Canadian Legion. Go around and charge a very low fee to cover my expenses, get to place, and then have a talk about different topics about veteran stuff. I mean, I don't want to do this because I don't want to even be talking here. I don't like publicity. I don't like to be out there. But the thing is nobody else is doing it, so I had to step up, or I felt I had to step up. In fact, that reminds me of a funny anecdote. First, when I started trying to do all this, and I was saying, they should fix this, they should fix that, and I'm trying to fix it, somebody sent me a snarky instant message, who selected you to do all this? I said, well, I selected myself. I mean, I didn't ask, nobody ordered me to do this. I mean, I could sit back and watch the government fuck over veterans all over the place. I mean, but it wouldn't sit with my conscience to let them do that without at least trying. I mean, I could try to do all my best and we could fail. But at least I tried. I mean, the people who are just doing this are acting as if they can't do anything to fix it, but I'll give you an example. They're the ones who broke the system. In the Facebook live broadcast I call Reading Between the Lines yesterday, I was talking about 2011 Canada Gazette. And it said that they had 2 submissions about the after 65 problem. Well, let me give you a recap of that because that was the very first Facebook live round. Okay, and from 1990 to present if you're an RCMP member, but to 2006 if you're an RCMP member, Canadian Forces member or veteran, you could get a payment for life if you were injured in service. That was called the Pension Act. And if you had a long-term disability the military had called the Service Income Support Insurance Plan from 1969 to 1995, you could get a lifetime payment under that insurance. But in 1995, the government said that they wanted to save money on the CISA plan, and they decided to end the lifetime benefits, and they ended it at age 65. Now, 11 years after that, they brought in the earnings loss benefit, and they copied on CISA, and then that meant they copied the age 65 problem. So they got rid of the pension, and they brought in a new system. They called it the earnings loss benefit, and they ended it at age 65. So they created the problem, okay? So there was no problem, but they created it. Now, naturally, when you have problems, people will speak up. At least, hopefully they will. So then people started saying, this ain't fair. Because, a lifetime injury should have a lifetime payment. You don't agree? Tell me you don't like it. But I think that if you get injured and you have a permanent injury, you also have to have a permanent payment. Now, they can make a lump sum payment, and that's permanent because that's going to last you the rest of your life. Or they can pay a lifetime payment every month, which, by the way, there are pros and cons to each one. Let me explain. If you have a Pension Act pension and you live a long time, you'll get a lot of money. If you have a Pension Act pension and you only lived a short time after you got the award, then your family, your descendants, your beneficiaries are not going to get as much money. If you got a lump sum and you die fairly soon after, well, you left an estate for your loved ones. But if you have a pension, the government tries to save by money. I mean, I saw in an overpayment thing that they said, oh, we have a problem because after veterans die, if they live a long life and then they die, we don't hear about it for a long time, and then we end up having an overpayment. Well, I don't see that as an overpayment at all, because the government owed the veteran or the veteran and their family, and if the payment was going into his bank account even though he was dead, that's the government's fault, and you should just say that that money is gone. You can't try to say that somebody owes the government, right? That's crazy, okay? The pension is the pensioner's property. William F. Nickel, 1916 or so. He said that the pension, once it's awarded, he put a caveat there, but he said that once awarded, the pension is the veteran's property, not income. Now, getting back to the point I was trying to make is that, there's a lot of things floating around in my head, and I'd like to get things out there and fixed. The problem with the after 65 thing is one of them. So, to give the recap, okay, so we're up to 2010. They put out a thing called a timely tune-up. So, they had a House of Commons committee that they sat down, looked at all this stuff, and they tried to fix the problems with the new Veterans Charter, which I say is bullshit, because if you're going to make a law, you're supposed to do all your planning ahead of time, prior to the law. So before you actually enact it, you should do your due diligence. You should do your homework first. And you shouldn't try to fix it later. That's just common sense. Now, 2010, they said there was a problem. 2011, they said it in the Canada Gazette that they were going to keep it. Okay, so that I was reading that off yesterday to whoever's watching. Look up yesterday's broadcast. So in the Canada Gazette from October 11, 2011, they said, some veterans complained about the after 65 problem, but we decided we're going to keep that as is. So they basically said, thanks for your input, but go fuck yourself. Now, I don't think that's a very good way the government could look at things. However, maybe they thought it was only a few people. Now, that might seem to justify it in their view, because a lot of people, if you watch Star Trek like I do, I'm a science fiction fanatic. I like a lot of stuff like Star Trek, Star Wars. I read a lot of science fiction books and stuff. If you recall a movie called Spock was in the, I remember the name anyway, the act. He was in the engine room dying of radiation poison, and he said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. Well, that sounds good, except in a democracy, when we have a democracy made up of individuals, the needs of the individual is the needs of the whole country. So if you try to say that, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, you could just use that little trope anytime. So if you have something you want to do, you just say, well, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, and you screw over the minority. But Canada brought in a Charter of Rights and Freedoms to protect the minority, and in Section 15.1 of the Charter, it lists off things like age, religion, disability, sex, gender, as things that you cannot screw people over on in law. Okay? So when Canada makes a law, it is not supposed to screw over people who are disabled, for example. So let me give you an example. Clawbacks. Clawbacks are in the Pension Act. Clawbacks are in the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act. Clawbacks are in the Old Age Security Act. They're in a lot of the various laws we have. In the Pension Act, they only claw back two things. A lawsuit in tort, so if someone harmed you, and it was of the same event that you had an injury in service on. My oft-repeated example is a soldier on duty on the base, a civilian car driving through the base on the road, hits the soldier, disables him. He sues the driver, but he gets a Pension Act pension. Nobody in their right mind would say he should get both forms of compensation. Nobody. You can't get compensated twice for the same injury. So, because of that, the Pension Act has a clawback of a tort lawsuit. However, the problem is who takes who into account when you have a clawback. I'll give you an example. Sault's British Columbia Court of Appeal in 2006 had a disabled RCMP member who became disabled because she was harassed a lot. So, first of all, they didn't have to harass her and they could have avoided paying damages. But they didn't. And then she suffered damages, ended up sick and disabled, and on Canada Pension Plan Disability, on the RCMP Disability Pension, on the Veterans Affairs Disability Pension, through the Pension Act. And the government of BC, because she wasn't allowed to sue the federal government because of Crown Liability and Proceedings Act Section 9. So that is another way to prevent double compensation. So they said that they want to take into account her RCMP Superannuation Act. Now, first of all, they ought to have known that a pension is not income, a pension is property, a pension belongs to the pensioner, that as you have service with any employer, you build up your asset, your pension for retirement. So by asking for the ability to take into account the the RCMP Superannuation Act, they were asking to violate the common law, because you cannot take a victim's assets and property into account. You can't. You're not allowed. The Bradburn Rule. Okay? Borrelli versus Flanagan, 1973, Ontario Court of Appeal. The judge said, there's no equitable principle that would allow the wrongdoer to take the assets and insurances and pensions of a disabled person that they created into account to save money for themselves. Now, if you can tell me that's fair, write a comment in there that you think I'm wrong. Do you think the person who runs you down should save money because you have money in the bank? Tell me. Or do you think it's fucking bullshit like I do? Okay? So the government wrote into the new Veterans Charter clawbacks of all the things that the Pension Act didn't claw back. What was their intent? Save money. Just like they save money on everything else. Now, I think I'm way off topic because I was talking about audits at the beginning, and here I am talking about clawbacks. Well, as far as I'm concerned, what they ought to do is look at the program and see audit, or somebody look at it and evaluate it, and then say, does this program operate within the rule of law? So then they could look at, say, the Veterans Wellbeing Act regulations, where they say they can take into account the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act. Well, then they say, well, can they do this? And then they'd say, well, can they do it under the Constitution? Do they have the jurisdiction? And then they'd say, well, property and civil rights are provincial, and this is a federal law. And then they'd probably say, well, there's grave concern here that we are within the jurisdiction. We are within our lane, that we had the ability to pass this law. Now, the other thing is, I was getting to the property thing again. They allege that the Canadian Forces pension is income, not property. So if it's property, because it's in the common law, like the Clark versus Clark Supreme Court of Canada 1990 case, if it's property and not income, then their whole premise that they can take into account the income from the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act and reduce the payment of the Veterans Affairs system is garbage, because you're not talking about income, you're talking about property. Now, a brief recap. Pensions, because I was talking to the advisor to General Latinchuk, the Deputy Administrator, the other day, So I was telling him a little bit about the way pensions work. Somebody has to own something. So technically, the employer owns the pension. But I know from reading common law cases on pensions that the pensioner owns it what they call beneficially or equitably. So while the legal ownership is the employer or the government of Canada, it's supposed to be ownership in your best interest. So they're supposed to act as a fiduciary. They're supposed to do things for your best interest to allow them to keep paying the pension. They're supposed to invest it. They're supposed to do this. They're supposed to put controls on the way they do things. What they're not supposed to do is harm the pensioner. For example, Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, Section 15.2b says that if you get the Canada Pension Plan, your Canadian Forces pension will be reduced. Now, that is against the law. Pensions cannot subsidize each other. But it is also harming a veteran, and my focus is always the disabled veteran. Okay, it might harm the healthy veteran too, but I'm more worried about the disabled veteran. So the disabled veteran can point to the Charter, Section 15.1, and they can say, you know, you're not supposed to write a law like Section 15.2a of the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act, which puts a burden on me, a soldier that was healthy until you sent me to war, and then I went to war, I became disabled, and then you want to save money at my expense. I would call that a burden, right? Now, that's not something I think that you can go to the Canadian Human Rights Commission about, because I think they are there to administer the Canadian Human Rights Act. Now, that's something that I used to have trouble differentiating between where do you go for a remedy. So if you have a problem with the human rights stuff and it's within their act, you can go to the commission, which is independent, and you can ask them for help. Now, if you have a problem with the charter, I think we have to go to court. So we have to go to a court of competent jurisdiction as per Section 24A of the charter. And we have to prove to a judge that this is against the law. And once you prove it's against the charter, it's not legal. You can't have a law that violates the charter, because all laws are supposed to correspond to our principles and our values, right? So we also have laws, procedural rights stuff, like Section 7, Section 11. Section 7 is pretty important. It's about security of the person. Now, myself and Dennis Manouche had a thought about that years ago. He agrees with me that we might want to do something about the breach of the security of the person because of psychological damage that they do to us on the Veterans Affairs side, maybe. Because everything that we do at Veterans Affairs, they have a culture of no. They tell us no. There's no such thing as they're trying to help you. When I was talking to Lieutenant General Cuppins the other day, he was saying that the Air Force had an attitude of trying to help people, assist the people, but the Army had an attitude that you had to do it by the book, and that was it, anal retentive. So instead of looking at things and trying to be reasonable, that was a culture difference between the Air Force and the Army. Now, I think people agree with that, generally. We used to have jokes that, you know, the idea of an Air Force person roughing it is having a 2-star hotel instead of a 3-star hotel. You know, but that's just people in different branches of service having rivalry, maybe. But the thing about all this is, we should be able to look at what's happening, and that's the subject of today's topic, ostensibly, the way the government audits things. And the whole idea of internal audit, I think, is kind of out in left field. But I did change my mind a bit, because I Googled it, and I said, what is the difference between an internal audit and an external audit? And I found a pretty good resource. I read down through it, and it seemed to make sense, say, for a big business. So it's about, you know, internal controls and trying to save money and trying to do things the right way. But, you know, in the choice of an internal and an external audit at Veterans Affairs or the Canadian Forces, I mean, it's kind of crazy to have you auditing yourself, because you will try to cover your ass. There was a case I was reading, and the judge said that this public servant, a bureaucrat, covered his bureaucratic ass. So they had a moving service, and they were tendering it. Now, the company that got it bid 0%. Now, how many companies would bid 0% on a government contract in order to get it? I mean, that's crazy. They should have discarded that tender. But they got it selected, and they were doing secondary billing, and they ended up, you know, the company that lost sued the government because of unfair practices, and then they got the contract, and then they got it was $100 million the contract was. When the judge was looking at it, Royal LePage, I think, got the contract, and they probably shouldn't have, because they bid 0%. Well, it was in court, so they shouldn't have got it, period. So it was about the Canadian Forces and RCMP moving service. You might want to look at that. Maybe there's something that affected people who had moves between, postings. But the thing that stuck in my mind is that the judge said that this bureaucrat, in order to save his salary, his pension, his career, he knew about the problem, but he didn't report it to his superiors. He covered his bureaucratic ass. Now, I believe the same thing could easily happen when you have the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman. I called the Canadian Forces Ombudsman recently. I want to tell him about something. When I called him, I got through to him, which is a very rare thing. They usually don't answer I guess they got call display and they see that I'm calling. So I get this new person. She says, what are you calling for? And I said, well, I want to call you about this possible problem with the cost of living on the CISA program, and that's a Canadian Forces program, and you should look into it. Then I heard voices in the background say something, and then she came back on the phone, and then she said, I've been told that we won't engage with you. And she hung up on me. Now, I don't think that's a very good way to spend public dollars, especially from an organization who were audited by the Auditor General in spring of 2015 and were said to be incompetent. So I immediately called the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I said, first of all, is Canadian Forces covered under your jurisdiction if I make a complaint? They said, yes. Well, I said, I believe I was discriminated against because of my mental disability, my obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, because I called them so much that I bugged them so much. I asked them to do their job and do their duty. They don't want to. And when I called, she told me that they wouldn't engage with me and hung up on me. Now, I'm not pissed off that she hung up on me. I'm pissed off because she's not doing her duty. They're getting paid for nothing. Right? They could look into this and they could try to help fix this, which is their mandate. That's what the ombudsmen are supposed to do. Right? Now, on a positive note, let me tell you about a 2003 audit, the Ombudsman, Canadian Forces Ombudsman. In my opinion, this led to the Dennis Manouche class action lawsuit. In 2003, the Canadian Forces Ombudsman released a report about how the CISA program would deduct the Pension Act. But if a soldier was still serving and they had a pension, they wouldn't do it. So they used comparative analysis. They compared two different systems, and they decided this was unfair. Now, I agree that it was unfair, but I will tell you that the Ombudsman was wrong. Okay? Why the Ombudsman was wrong is that if you get a payment for your injury, you're getting a capital payment. A capital payment is not income. So if you got injured and the injury was so small that you had a small pension and you're still serving, you're getting income from your service with the government. But the payment from the Pension Act is for your injury, and it is not for your service. So it's not double payment. On the other hand, when a veteran is getting the pension and CISA, you're getting insurance, which is not income, and you get the Pension Act pension, which is an indemnity for your loss, capital payment for your loss. And you are entitled to both your insurance and your damages in tort if you went to court. You had CISA and you had run down by a car. Again, that example I always use. Then when you get your damages from the person who injured you in the car, well, you also get your CISA, and they can't take each other into account. That's called the Bradburn Rule. So, the Ombudsman ought to have known about the way it works. He's a professional. Andre Marin, M-A-R-A-I-N is his name. I meant to call him and ask him. But the thing is he did expose it, but, they made some mistakes along the way. So I think the government, now don't call me paranoid, I think the government saw this case in 2003. Then they knew the shit was going to hit the fan one of these days. So I think the new Veterans Charter came into effect because they wanted to get rid of the problem where a veteran could get CISA plus the pension. Tell me I'm wrong. They got rid of the pension, there was no more problem, was there? People want a pension brought back? Well, the government got rid of it, in my opinion, in order to get rid of the liability for paying both CISA and the pension at the same time, which we found out was unlawful in the Manouche case. But the Manouche case came in 2007, 4 years after that 2003 report, by the Ombudsman. So the Ombudsman can do some good. The problem is that instead of ordering it to be fixed, we had to wait for someone to sue, right? So instead of the Ombudsman having the ability to hear a case, investigate, hear sides out during the investigation, and then issue an order, which is mandatory, to say, listen, there's a problem here, and you have to pay both the pension and CISA at the same time. Again, I bet you a lot of the people that might be watching this are part of the Dennis Manouche class action lawsuit, and good on him for suing the government, because his amount, and I saw this in the affidavits, didn't have to talk to him, although I did a bunch of times, his pension was piss off. Very, very low amount. He was doing it based on principle, obviously, and he was only getting SISIP for a couple of years. They kicked him off after a while, which brings up the point of they're trying to save money, they kick people off, right? Just like they don't pay people pensions a lot of time, and I'm straying off topic. Everybody who's watching probably knows that the government usually say if you're going to get medical release, well, they might know you're disabled and can't serve, so they kick you off at 9.5 years. It takes 10 years to get your pension, so they kick you off early, so they will save on the pension side. Now, it is my allegation that this is the problem that keeps coming up, because in 2013, the Ombudsman reported, again, the Veterans Ombudsman, a lot of my evidence comes from those people. So if they can't do anything else, at least they provide that evidence to people like me who read it. So in 2013, they talked about 406 veterans that were at risk, because they're of the way the system is working. So they didn't have a Canadian Forces pension. They didn't have this. They didn't have that. So they were at risk, which they meant financially at risk. But the problem is the government set all these programs up, and they were the ones who created that veteran to be at risk, right? So the government set up the programs, and they said, well, we're going to make it 10 years instead of 2 in order to vest for your pension. Well, how can that be fair? I think the RCMP want us to. I know the Public Service want us to. And I know that the Reserve Force want us to. So if you look at the preponderance of evidence, the preponderance of what happens, common sense says that the military ought to have 2. Now, when I brought that up in the past, someone told me that in the States you need 20. I don't care what the States have. That's their business. I care about what we have. Okay? If you tell me that it's fair for the military to have a 10-year vesting period when the Public Service only has 2, so civilians have a better deal. Now, some people might like to get their lump sum payment. The reason I say that is that came across my mind. I mean, I don't always think of everything all at once. But let's say you serve 9.5 years. So you have a sizable lump sum that they will do in a return of contributions. So they give you a return of contributions, and then you go and get your disability payments from SISIP. There's no Canadian Forces pension to be deducted. So you're going to get your full SISIP, and you have your lump sum. You go to Veterans Affairs and get the income replacement benefit. There's no pension for them to deduct, and you had your lump sum. Now, knowing them, I bet you they put in there that if you got a return of contributions, that they're going to reduce your payment anyway. Betcha $1 million. So, but on the surface of it, you might come out ahead with the return of contributions. But let me tell you something else, and I don't know if this is true. The government always claims that it puts more money in our pension than we put in, which I say is bullshit, because it's a defined benefit pension. I could put 1 cent in, I could put 0 in, I could put $1 million in, but my pension will be based on a formula that's in the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act. Now, in the return of contributions, and maybe somebody out there has experienced this, and let me know, and I'd like to look into it later. Do you only get what you put in, or do you get the $3.78 that the government put in on your behalf if they had given you the pension? Because in the 2007 Treasury Board report on total compensation, they said on average, the government puts in $3.78 for every dollar the soldier puts in. But then they explained that it's really not a big deal. And then they said historically it's been even higher. So it all depends. You see, that's the way pensions work. When an employer has a pension, they agree to fund the person later on in life. So they save money in the now, and they defer their costs to the future. Now, they then have to make sure that the pension is sustainable. So the money that the government is putting in is not the current service contribution. It's the money that they need to maintain based on the actuarial report that based on this amount of time over, we have this many people, this much money, and to pay all these people for the rest of their life, and they're making guesses about who will die when and stuff, then we need this much money in the plan. So when the government puts $3.78 in for every dollar the soldier puts in, they're doing nothing abnormal. That is exactly how pensions work. But they somehow have equated that the soldier, the veteran, is getting a benefit out of this. And then Prime Minister Harper in 2012 decided that he was going to make soldiers pay 50% of the Canadian Forces Superannuation Act. I don't like the man, I won't pretend I do. And he's supposed to be a professional. But how could he be the Prime Minister and not understand how pensions work? He ought to have advisors that tell him, excuse me, Prime Minister, the money that we put in there is just to maintain the sustainability of the pension. And we could have paid the soldier more when he served and then not had a pension, and that would have been the way it is. He would have been on their own to make their own pension. But because we passed a law to say that they had to have money deducted, and we then never paid them their full wage when they served, we owe them money because we owed them the money that they didn't get because we, deferred the cost. Now, add to that the contribution. See, in the past, they said that there was contributory and non-contributory pensions. So, in the IBM versus Waterman case, IBM wanted to take Buddy's pension into account because he didn't pay a dime in it himself. He didn't make any contributions. The Supreme Court of Canada said he earned it with his service. Now, I view that as a landmark case that they had to rewrite the history books, the law books about pensions, because now there's no such thing as a contributory pension, right? Or maybe it's a non-contributory. What I'm saying is, everybody assumed that there was two types of pension. One where the employer paid it all, that was a non-contributory one, and one where you had contributory one where you paid and the employer paid. But after that case, you should be able to look at that, and then if they weren't stupid, they'd look at the 1969 case in Perry versus Cleaver in England. And that case, they wanted to take pensions into account, and the judges said, well, pensions are much like insurance. And if the working man's service, weekly service, paid for the pension he got, you can't take it into account simply because he didn't pay cash into it, that his service, which had value. I mean, it's the exact same thing. But it seems like all these cases in the past precedent are being ignored, right? They're ignoring the law, Andrews versus Grandin Toy case, when they did the new Veterans Charter. Because, well, the Andrews versus Grandin Toy said you get a capital payment, not an income payment. So if you get injured and someone has to pay it back, like workers' comp or tort law, then basically you're getting a capital payment because you had a capital loss. Now, capital is your body. If your body is capital and your body gets injured, then you have to get a payment in kind. Apples and apples, oranges and oranges. Now, if someone hurts your income, I guess you get an income payment. But in terms of bodily injury, that's a capital payment. Anyway, getting back to the topic, and I'm going to try to make these things about 30 minutes if I can. I mean, any longer, and we probably won't be able to have anybody tune in and stay tuned. And the thing is people that have an interest in it are going to be more interested in it than other people. Like, I think I saw my Uncle Rod watching, and like, the thing is, he might watch because of his family. I don't think he was ever in the military. I think his brother was. And that's the thing. I mean, I created at one point, and this is a slightly much off topic, I guess, just to tell you about it. I was getting tired of being so negative all the time about this shit. Okay, so I set up a couple of Facebook groups like Observation Post Fishing, because my dad was a fisherman, and I fished for 2 years, from 1983 to 1984. And I put pictures of people from my hometown in there. And I started a group called Observation Post Lawners, because my hometown is called Lawn. Lima Alpha Whiskey November. Strange name, but I called it Lawners, and then later I started putting other close-by communities, because there are many people from my community that joined the military. Uncle Fred was in the military a long time, and that's one of the reasons I joined. Right? He'd be always coming home. Funny story, brought me home an M72 shell after exercise. I guess they were blowing up stuff with the light anti-tank weapon, and he brought home 3 of them, but then he knew I was interested in the military, so he gave his oldest brother a 22 rifle, and he gave me the shell from the M72. It's a throwaway thing, if the people don't know. And I brought it to grade 3 show and tell. So I brought it up and showed and tell that, look at what I got, a rocket launcher. So I've had a lifelong interest in the military, but the thing is, unless you have an interest in all this stuff, now my main point about here is justice, because you shouldn't be doing stuff to people and then say it's just, but it's not. They try to explain that it's fair because everybody else is doing it, but that's not fair, that's not just, that's popularity. Like, so if someone wants to save money and they start clawing back, and the insurance companies and the employers across Canada are doing clawbacks of everything all across the board, don't go to town to tell me that it's fair and legal and just because they all do it. Now, I was gonna do like every one of these episodes, I'm gonna do a bad faith segment, and I'm not sure if I did this before. That's the problem with me. I'm winging it, right? But in section 24B and 44B of the Service Income Support Insurance Plan Policy 901-102, I wish I didn't have to memorize all this stuff. I'm good with numbers. Numbers stick in my head. Funny story on that one. One time I went over at CRA to discuss a case with someone, and I told her, social insurance number, blah, 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 blah. How do you know that? You're not supposed to know that. I said, I looked at his file a couple times. Now I know his number. I can't tell you what it is now, but at the time it was relevant. Anyway, in section 44B and 24B of the SISP policy, it states that if you have a clawback amount, they will not take it into account. It's not considered relevant income according to their policy, according to the words inserted in the contract, which, by the way, in order to have a contract, normally you're supposed to have some kind of negotiation. I say that the SISP policy is not really a policy because there was no negotiation in it. But they aren't supposed to take it into account. So I called up Manulife when I suspected this was happening. I said, listen, how much are you taking out for my Canada Pension Plan Disability? He said, $1,073. I said, you're breaking the policy then, because section 44B of the policy, I'm a reservist, so that was my section. I said, that tells me that the cost of living and the clawback amount is not supposed to be taken into account. He said, well, the computer uses a complex algorithm, blah, blah, blah. I said, stop right there. All I got to do is look at the two numbers. The initial amount that I was awarded and the amount that you told me you're taking out right now. Now, a few weeks later, same thing came up with the Reserve Force Pension Plan. Called him up again. I asked him a question. He said, we're taking out this much right now. I said, or we started that. We started at this much. I said, excuse me, but that wasn't what I asked you. I said, I asked you, how much are you taking at this moment in time? He told me. And I said, you're breaching the contract again. And then he told me there's nothing I can do about it. Nothing you can do about it anyway. Right? He said, you were part of the class action with Dennis Mnuchin, and they had a COLA, cost of living adjustment, part of that. Now, I wasn't part of that. But my point is that if you want to do a little bit of homework, if you think this is a possible class action, okay? The amount of money is very insignificant. In my case, when I looked at it, it was about $600 for a couple of years, right? Now, that was with the Canada Pension Plan and my Reserve Force Pension Plan. So what you need to do if you want to do this little experiment, if you look at your original award or contact the Canadian Forces Pension or the Canada Pension Plan, ask them how much your original award was if you don't have the paperwork. Get that figure, then either call or write or email Manulife and get the figure of how much you're taking out right now. If the two numbers do not match, you're getting screwed over because they're breaking the contract. Okay? Now that's one of my examples of bad faith, because they put that into the contract and the contract binds them to act according to the contract. So it's a stupid thing to do, because why would you want to give the opposition ammunition? If I'm going to sue these fuckers one of these days, why would you give me examples of bad faith? Why would you not pay the insurance at the end of the month like it says in the contract? Why would you take into account the cost of living when it says in the contract you're not supposed to do it? Why would you have a cap of 2% on the insurance? Why would you have a different rate for a part-time veteran versus a full-time veteran? For example, on that one, in 2011, the government said in Bill C-55 that they would bring in a new rate for the earnings loss benefit for disabled reservists. And instead of being 75% of $2,000, a deemed $2,000, they said it was going to be 75% of a deemed $2,700 a month. SISP didn't comply with that, even though they're supposed to be first payer on medical release. But somebody browbeat them into it between October 2011, when they announced the program change, and March of 2012, they decided to change it at SISP too. So when I got approved in 2013, they based my rate on 75% of a deemed $2,700 a month, but it's nowhere to be seen in the policy. So I was getting SISP from 2013, and they made it retroactive to my release date of the 19th of January 2012, and they paid me 75% of $2,700, which is $2,025 a month. Now, Then they cut me out in 2017, but for the years that I was on it, they should have been paying me all that stuff properly. But I say that, that's stupid because, well, I was getting a rate based on the new Veterans Charter. What they did is they had that in the regulations, and they were using the exact same rate for SISIP, even though they didn't change the contract. Now, later, they tried to tell me that my SISIP and VAC are on different systems, and when I called them to ask them about the 75% instead of the deemed amount in 2015, they said, well, that's the other guy's program. That's not our program. That's the divide and conquer thing, see? They're trying to keep us dazed and confused. I'm going to call this broadcast off in a minute, but I'll tell you about an insurance fellow who in the States, he wrote a book in the 90s. He came out of the insurance industry, and then he told all in a book, and he released some of the tricks. So confuse and refuse, delay and deny. Don't tell me that's not what Veterans Affairs Canada's doing. But the thing is, they've always been doing it. In 1981, there was a 12-month delay to get a Pension Act pension. In 1990-something, there was an 18-month. It didn't get better. It got worse. Okay? And then I always see people complaining about how long it takes these days. But, I think they're playing games with, I haven't figured out if I'm right or not, but I think they're not really talking about, they should be talking about how long it takes to get a successful application. Right? I think they're counting something different when they're saying there's this many days service period to get serviced. I think they're fudging the numbers, and people haven't caught on yet. And I can't put my finger on exactly what they're doing yet, but I'm having my suspicions because, what they ought to do is look at the time it takes from the time you initially apply to the date you actually get approved and get the money. Right? Tell me I'm wrong. I think I'm a very common sense. I should call this observation close common sense. But what is an ordinary man's sense of justice? That's the thing. I was talking to a veteran on terror the other day, and he was talking about common sense, and he asked me what it was. Later, I was thinking, it's like the Great Western Railway versus Bradburn case in 1875, and they talked about the ordinary man's sense of justice. Now, that's you and me. So how many people out there think it's okay to reduce your Canadian Forces pension because of your Canada pension plan? How many people out there think it's okay for the Government of Canada to reduce its legal liability under the Veterans Wellbeing Act because they want to take into account your Canadian Forces pension or your Canada pension plan or this or that, right? It all comes down to a breach of privacy, in my opinion. Now, I tried to report this to the Privacy Commission, but I think they're another one of those people that don't want government to get in trouble. So, I don't know if it's because they don't want to pay more taxes or if they don't want to give the government a black eye. But the 2012 privacy audit said that, we found a systemic problem when they send out the income replacement benefit and the rehabilitation application in the same envelope because they're collecting information that if they don't get approved for the rehabilitation program, then they have no need for the information contained on the earnings loss benefit income replacement benefit application. As I told the Office of the Veterans Ombudsman lady I spoke to yesterday, a different lady than the junior one, a more senior one, I said, listen here, I would have wrote that differently. I would have said, Privacy Act Section 4 is being violated because Veterans Affairs Canada has no right to get the information on the earnings loss benefit application prior to approval from the rehabilitation program. Because you know how Veterans Affairs responded to the Privacy Commissioner's audit report? We're going to ask the veteran for consent. Listen, you can't consent to a breach of the law. I looked that up when I was looking up the definition of assault. If two guys get into a fight, I was wondering if they consented to the fight and any subsequent injury, but you can't consent to an illegal act. You can't say, go ahead and murder me or something. You're not supposed to. Where would the profit be in it? Unless you had a life insurance policy or something and you're dying already or whatever. But my point is that there's a lot of shit in my head, yeah. But I'm hoping that people will understand that the government has no right to do this, okay? The Pension Act, Section 30, should have stopped SISIP in its tracks. The Bradburn Rule should have stopped SISIP in its tracks, right? The Bradburn Rule and Pension Act Section 30 should have stopped Veterans Affairs in its tracks, and that one's worse. In the case of the Pension Act being deducted by the Department of National Defense's insurance, that's two different departments. But when you think about Veterans Affairs doing it in the Toth Tango Oscar Tango Hotel case, that is markedly different. markedly worse because Veterans Affairs program was taken into account another Veterans Affairs program. I mean, I don't know what they're smoking, but maybe they should give some of that to us.